Good evening. I'm really glad to see you here on this relatively warm autumn evening in Vienna. I welcome you to our panel discussion, Climate Change, Solutions in Times of Crisis. My name is Martina Neuwirth. I work for the VIDC, the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, a think and do tank, as we like to call ourselves. And I'm working on international finance and economy. Let me first very warmly welcome our guests here in Vienna. Jacqueline Cottrell, who came to us from Scotland, Moritz Schwarz, and our moderator, Sigrid Stagel. And of course, also a very warm welcome to our two distinguished guests in South Africa who will join us via Zoom, Rochelle Ramphol and Kagalelo Makamela. I know it's a bit early, but I already want to draw your attention to those QR codes that you can see in the room. And these QR codes will lead you to a short questionnaire. And we would really ask you to fill out that questionnaire after the event because it would help us become better in organizing and planning our VIDC events. And of course, you know that planning and organizing, you can do a lot on your own, but you cannot do anything on your own. And therefore, I really thank my colleagues at the VIDC, all of them who helped me in organizing it. I also want to thank Alexandra Wojewska in the back. She co-curated this event with me, and she will do the reporting today. Finally, and we have seen that in the previous days in Baku, you can do a lot without money, but not all of it. So I want to thank the Austrian Development Agency for its financial support of our program and of course also of this event. So it's end of November. We are approaching Christmas. Ooh. And we are approaching the end of the year, 2024, and we all know that it has been the hottest year ever in history, at least the history we know. And I think we can all remember very well the devastating floods here in Austria, in Vienna as well. And I think we have all still have in mind the news about the disastrous floods in Spain, especially in southern Spain. Southern Spain being a region that had already experienced a prolonged drought. And southern Spain is not the only region in Europe, and it's not the only region in the world that experiences and has experienced such disasters. Because the effects of global warming can be felt all over the world, you know that, with poor people in poor countries being the most affected because they simply do not have the means to protect themselves against the effect of global warming. So what we see is emissions are rising. They have risen in 2024 already. Also inequalities are rising and deepening within and between countries. And we have also, I have to say, a financial crisis with shrinking public budgets and a lot of countries facing a severe debt crisis. Coming back to Baku for 1 minute again, I think that finding global solutions for global crisis will become even more difficult than it has become in the past. But I think that business as usual is no option. So we have to face this crisis, and also our governments will have to face this crisis. And so today we will assess the tools that governments have in their toolbox for reducing one-way CO2 emissions and at the same time fostering a socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable future. That means, in other words, that we have to find ways to transition to a low-carbon economy while leaving no one behind. That's really a tremendous task, I would say. So today we will look at various governmental instruments like taxation, regulation, subsidies, incentives, and so on. And taxation being a very important tool of governments, we will have a deeper look in environmental taxation. And I'm really happy that to present a brand new VIDC paper called The Climate of Equality. You can find it outside this room if you want to have a copy. And one of the authors sits with us. It's Jacqueline Cottrell. And I think she will present some of the findings of this study and will share them with us a bit later. What we also will learn today are the experiences of South Africa. By the way, the only African country who has a carbon tax. South Africa, we know it, is an upper middle income country, yes, but it's also a country of the global South, an African country. And we know that Africa as a continent is the continent that is most affected by global warming. And it is also a country that is characterized by extreme inequality, at least according to the World Inequality Lab. So it would be really interesting to hear from our colleagues from South Africa, how the South African government is dealing with all those issues and problems it is facing. Now, before I hand over to our moderator, Sigrid Stagel, let me shortly introduce her, although I think that everyone, or nearly everyone, already knows her. Sigrid Stagel is an economist and a full professor at the University of Economics and Business in Vienna, the WU. Currently, she works on institutional arrangements that support sustainable work. So she works on work, socioeconomic theories of human behavior. And I think human behavior is a tricky thing sometimes that comes across certain processes that we think are certain, but then human behavior comes in. And the effects of the financialization of the environment. She's the founder and director of the Institute for Ecological Economics and the director of the Competence Center for Sustainability Transformation at the WU. So we live in interesting times, and so may we have an interesting discussion today. So Sigrid, over to you. Thank you.
Is it better now? Yeah. Sorry. Climate change, solutions in times of crises and plural, of course, unfortunately. Tools, trade-offs, and global responsibilities. So today, the search is on for effective strategies and the most effective approaches to reducing emissions and adapting to climate change while addressing inequalities. And Martina mentioned already, these are trying times. It's harder because it's more urgent. And multilateralism and international cooperation are not very high on the agenda of a lot of governments at the moment. But that means we just need to be more creative and more ambitious. And I think we can achieve that with the very distinguished panel that we have today. I'll start with Moritz Schwarz, who is a climate economist based at the TU Berlin and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, as well as the University of Oxford. Alongside academia, he has been involved in various policy roles, including numerous engagements as a negotiator at the UNFCCC climate negotiations. In his research, he is focusing on quantifying the effects of climate policies. And Mr. Schwarz is co-author of the international study Climate Policies that Achieved Major Emissions Reductions, Global Evidence from 2 Decades, which was recently published in Science. Welcome. Then we have Jacqueline Cottrell. She was already briefly introduced, but I'll do it more fully. Is a consultant specializing in green fiscal policy and green public finance in low and middle income countries. She works for a range of clients, including the French and German development agencies and UN organizations. She's a director of Ecotrel Limited and freelance associate at Green Budget Germany. Mrs. Cottrell is co-author of the VIDC study that was already highlighted on climate of fairness, environmental taxation and tax justice in developing countries. That was 6 years ago. And now the follow-up study, fresh off the press today, a climate of equality, protecting the environment and safeguarding justice in a progressive tax system. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And then we have online Rochelle Ramphal. I hope you can hear us well. Yes, I see some nodding. Excellent.
Yes.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
Rochelle is a green finance and extractive sector governance expert and founder of Finance Net Earth, a consultancy with expertise in finance and fiscal policy solutions for the trajectory to net zero carbon emissions. She's an associate professor at the Department of Auditing at the University of South Africa. Professor Ramphal has worked with many international agencies to develop energy transition policies for the extractive sector. Her most recent study investigated the role of financial and fiscal reforms in upscaling renewable energy access for the business sector in South Africa. Welcome. And last but not least, we have sorry, I practiced this, but Kalalelo Makamela is a chartered accountant and academic with expertise in finance, taxation, and sustainable development, focusing on carbon pricing. After being lecturer at the University of Pretoria, she currently is senior lecturer in finance at the University of Johannesburg. Mrs. Makamela is also a technical specialist on carbon pricing at Financing Net Earth, where she applies her expertise to support sustainable financing initiatives. She's a member of the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants Carbon Tax Subcommittee. Welcome. So the event is consists of 3 parts. First, we will have 4 presentations, 10 minutes each. Then we will have a half-hour discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll have a half-hour discussion, all of us. Yeah. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Schwarz for his presentation.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks a lot for the introduction and even more for the invitation. So looking at the kind of tools that we need in this debate, in the climate policy debate, is something that I'll try to dive into a little bit over the next hopefully 10 minutes, and please do stop me if I go on too long. I can waffle about this for a long time. But what I'm trying to give you a bit of a sense is about the insights that we've developed over the past, I would say, 5 years. We've published a set of studies that tries to really ask the question, which kind of tools and which kind of policies have actually been successful in reducing carbon emissions, that led to the study that was mentioned that we published this August, which for the first time tried to take a bit of a global perspective at the question, which types of policies are actually successful in reducing carbon emissions. And the motivation for that obviously comes from the fact that luckily in our discussions around the world, we see the proliferation of more and more climate policies. So governments really do pay attention to the question, how do we reduce carbon emissions, and try to bring forward policies in different sectors and in different types all around the world. But of course, just implementing a policy on its own does not necessarily guarantee that carbon emissions will actually be reduced. And we call this this instance of trying to figure out which ones of them have actually been successful as the evaluation gap. And I'll try to get at why we see a gap here. So first of all, most governments try to think about policies only one time, and that is before they implement it. So most governments try to have fancy impact assessments and try to ex ante try to figure out what this policy is likely to do, once it's through Parliament, most governments don't really care too much about it, at least in the political sphere. At the same time, most of academic knowledge and most of academic studies focus on a number of small types of policies that are very popular, both in terms of getting it published, but also in terms of which ones were famous or well debated. So you'll find hundreds of studies about carbon pricing. You'll find much fewer studies about other topics. And the other element is, well, most policymaking actually doesn't happen with singular policies being implemented. Most governments, if they try to pass a certain package, try to pass a whole set of measures where you might have a pricing or a tax instrument, but you also might have a change in a number of regulations. So most governments actually pass policy mixes, but most evaluations actually only look at singular policies. And so both the proliferation of all of those climate policies over the past, I would say, 2 decades and more, as well as this evaluation gap, led us to the question of, well, how can we actually try to tackle this point and trying to figure out what actually works? So what we've done is we've partnered with the OECD, and the OECD had developed what we believe is the most comprehensive database of climate policies around the world. So the OECD has gone to over 50 governments and asked them, which types of climate policies have you passed over the past 30 years? Try to evaluate them, try to collate them, try to double check whatever the governments were telling them, and created this database of 1,500 climate policies around the world. And what we've done is we've combined that with a number of techniques that we've developed over the past 5-6 years at the University of Oxford to try to combine concepts that we've known for a long time in time series econometrics together with some methods that have been around in causal inference that really allow us to say what has caused something or not. And so that combination of this new type of method with that new type of database allowed us to evaluate over 1,500 climate policies around the world. Now, out of those 1,500 policies, we've very quickly realized that most of them don't really help us in getting across the line in terms of enabling major emission reductions. And I want to put a focus on this major emission reduction because what we've been trying to look at is not a policy that would maybe tinker at the edges, but really think about where have we managed to, really get going and really reduce emissions in a major sense. So we've tried to look at policies, that were able to at least sort of push forward carbon emissions down by 6, 7, or 8%, with our average across all of them that we've identified to be about 19%, which is a major emission reductions over these years. So out of these instances that we looked at, we picked out 41 countries with around 15 of them in the developing world and about 25 in developed countries. We would have loved to have more in the developing world from developing countries, but of course there are some data limitations that we couldn't pass through. And I overall identified about 65 to 70 instances where we found that policies really have shown extreme success in reducing carbon emissions. And overall, these policies have reduced carbon emissions by roughly about 1.8 billion tons of carbon. What does that mean in the bigger sense? Well, if we look at the 2030 emissions gap, then we could see that if we were actually successful in replicating these types of successes, then we could probably close that emissions gap by up to 40%, up to 41%. Now, that means we do have good examples of what policies we could potentially implement, but of course, even at our sort of optimistic look at trying to replicate that success around the world, we could only get 40% of the way. So clearly, we can learn from historical data and we can learn from what has happened in the past, but it's very clear that we do need to think about policies on top. Now, looking at all of those instances where we've had success, obviously the question is, well, what has actually worked and what can we learn from them? And we kind of see these instances of success as a guide for future policymaking. And there it's more or less three crucial messages that I want to sort of give you in that sense. The first one is that we've really seen that policies are more successful if they don't try to do everything through one policy, but try to design well-designed policy mixes that really tackle a number of different actors and a number of different sectors at the same time. So that really means we need to think about a change in the way that we evaluate them, but also in the way that we design them going forward. The second point really is that there's no one size fits all. We haven't found a single country that had successful policies in all sectors that we looked at. And we looked at the industrial sector, the power sector, the transport sector, and the building sector. So no country was actually successful in all of them. At the same time, we also have seen that developing countries and developed countries often need different types of policies. We've seen that the more saturated a certain market or a certain sector is in terms of its emissions, so the lower the growth rate, the more I can rely on carbon pricing and on price instruments that really drive a market. But when a country is more in a growth state, or a sector is more in a growth state, then actually it's much more important in terms of emissions to try to avoid lock-in effects and to think about technology standards or efficiency standards. So clearly a sort of increasing mobility sector in countries like China have a very different set of policies that work than a very well-established industrial sector in Europe. The second key message that we found is that a building sector or a mobility sector are very different from a power sector or an industrial sector in terms of the number of actors that are involved. And the more actors, obviously buildings, mobility, we've got millions of actors buying cars or heating their homes. The more actors, the more differential policy instruments I actually need. So the EU ETS works really well because I only have about 15 to 20,000 installations that actually work with it. Something like this will be very different to do on the number of actors that are in the buildings or the mobility sector. We can talk about EU policy and EU ETS a little bit differently, but that's a general kind of insight. Now, the last point that I sort of want to mention is one that we haven't seen in our study because our study hasn't looked at that dimension, but it clearly comes out when we try to interpret our data and try to compare it with existing literature. And that's that when policies are designed in that mix and actually do think about, the social equity the kind of component of these types of standards, then more ambition is possible. So we've often seen that in instances where the questions of equity or the questions of social compensation isn't part of a certain policy mix, then often the ambition of that policy mix is lacking. And so really it's that type of policy dimension that we need to think about. We need to think about policies in policy mixes that are well designed for the particular area that they're targeting. We need to think about the number of actors. We need to think about the growth rate of emissions in a certain sector, and we need to think about the social policy dimension. And throughout all of those things, our study is, a first trial at these things. If we were to get into some of the details, there'd be lots of things where I'd say those are crucial limitations that we haven't been able to do. But I think those are probably some of the interesting things that could be insightful for other discussions. I see 1 minute being scribbled, so I will shut up here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. A few months ago, 55 researchers here in Vienna and Austria, all of Austria, tried to evaluate a mix of policies to support the Ministry of Climate Action to fill the 13% gap. But that was only a small number of policies. Well, it was 1,000 measures that we were comparing and trying to mix and see which ones worked best, but it was only for one country. So a small effort compared to your study, and which was led to really interesting results. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Let's move on to Jacqueline Cottrell. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, as I think everybody has gathered by now, I'm here most of all to present a very short summary of this publication that you can collect from outside: A Climate of Equality, Protecting the Environment and Safeguarding Justice in a Progressive Tax System. And I'd like just to highlight a few points from the study. Some of it's quite technical, and we can discuss more of the technicalities later if it comes up in our discussions. But what I wanted to do was try and give an overview of some of the main points that we wanted to make in the paper, and to explain the objective and what we are trying to do with the paper itself. So in the tax justice movement, there are a lot of discussions about how to reconcile environmental taxation and carbon taxation with the key principles of the tax justice movement, so equity, fairness, and progressivity of taxation. It's received a lot of attention, this discussion, because indirect taxes, such as carbon taxes and environmental taxes more broadly, are inherently regressive. They're not designed bearing in mind the ability of the taxpayer to pay. They're designed to tax a particular tax base, an environmental tax base. And as a result, there's often a lot of pushback from the tax justice movement to carbon and environmental taxation due to concerns about distributional impacts. And the same can be true, perhaps not for quite the same motivations, but for many governments and finance ministries. They're also concerned about what the social and distributional impacts of introducing a carbon tax might be. And very often we see, therefore, that these concerns about progressivity and about potential negative impacts resulting carbon taxes and other environmental taxes being introduced at a very low rate, where they're not really environmentally effective. They're not achieving behavioral change and meaningful emissions reductions, which after all is the purpose of the tax itself. So what our paper tried to do is bring some clarity to this discussion and really make clear that we have to understand the way that we implement carbon taxes and environmental taxes. And this slots quite nicely into what Moritz was saying as well about policy mixes. We need to see them as an integral part of the fiscal system, and we need to see that they're complemented by redistributive mechanisms, by compensation measures, by expenditures to ensure that the negative impacts are addressed, while enabling us to use carbon taxes to achieve the kind of urgent emissions reductions that we need to achieve, as we all know. And a fundamental part of our approach in explaining that is introducing the concept of welfare measures that really bring together social and environmental policy objectives within the concept of an eco-social welfare state. So that's the overarching story of what we're trying to look at in the publication. I'd like to pick out 3 points within that I think probably quite interesting for us to discuss. And the first one is the question of fairness and the polluter pays principle and carbon taxation. I assume everyone's familiar with the polluter pays principle, the key tool for the delivery of environmental objectives in a fair manner. If you pollute, you should pay to cover the cost of that pollution. So if we look at the climate crisis, you can see that the top 10% of emitters are responsible for nearly half of all global carbon emissions. So there's quite a strong argument for the polluter pays principle in introducing a carbon tax. And failure to implement it can be equated with a failure to address the inequality of contributions to pollution. So this lines up very much with the concerns of many NGOs, Oxfam, the Tax Justice Network, with the failure to really deliver on climate justice and to deliver on the concept of common and differentiated responsibilities in terms of tackling the climate crisis. And if the reaction to the concern about distributional impacts is not to implement a carbon tax, then we're not using the fiscal system to realize that fairness with the polluter pays principle, or equity, or tax justice, actually, Because if we're introducing that carbon tax at a low rate, then we're not going to bring about the emissions reductions that we need to see that fairness at a national level, but also at a global level as well. So we're failing there to implement the polluter pays principle. So our concern is, what can we do instead? We can see that there's a failure now to implement. We can see that carbon taxes are too low. We can see that the climate crisis is becoming sharper. We're running out of time to act and to introduce the kind of mixes of measures that we need. So that's what takes me to the second part of what we try and do in the paper, which is to design social compensation mechanisms really well. And this is a bit about the ex ante and really working to understand social impacts and to predict them very accurately, to take direct impacts into account, indirect impacts, and to really work to understand multiple dimensions of deprivation, specifically in lower middle income countries. This is a really important point to consider: how are women affected, the elderly, how are the urban poor affected and the rural poor from the introduction of a carbon tax or a price on energy or another environmental tax. And on the basis of that, then introducing suitable instruments to tackle those problems. And what we discuss in the paper as well is this concept of an eco-welfare state, so a political and an economic system in which the government really prioritizes, on the one hand, environmental protection, but also on the other, citizens' well-being, and trying to bring those two together when we are thinking about how we tackle the climate crisis. How do we deal with social well-being as well? How do we bring those together? And I think if we want to see instruments introduced that can really tackle climate change, the kind of mixes that Moritz and his colleagues have identified, then we need to think about how we can bring that social aspect front and center of the environmental policies that we're implementing and the climate policies that we are looking to develop. And what we are hoping is, by bringing this approach a bit more into the mainstream and into discussions around how to implement carbon taxation, we'll move from pushback against the notion of introducing a carbon tax at a higher level to greater levels of acceptance, so that we can start to introduce and design measures which introduce a really meaningful price on carbon and can bring about reductions using the carbon price, which we can see at the moment are not particularly successful, while at the same time tackling the issues like inequality and fostering well-being. We also think about in the paper, of course, the context of low and middle income countries. And there we have quite a long look at very many different strategies that governments can implement. So on the one hand, of course, we have quite high-tech databases and tools with which we can introduce social compensation in the context of the European Union, for example. But we also look at low-tech solutions, like working with local communities to understand which households are vulnerable in a particular area, or piggybacking on existing instruments in developing countries, which create the possibility to introduce the welfare state, also in countries without the kind of data that we have in the EU, for example. And then perhaps the final point that I'd like to make would be to talk about carbon taxes and the rich, because this is another point that we wanted to address in the paper. There's a lot of discussion as well about carbon wealth taxes and what that might mean for environmental taxation, for climate change mitigation, and so on. So as I already mentioned, we can see that the wealthiest people on the planet tend to emit far more. So on the one hand, one thing that the paper does is highlight the ways in which a carbon tax itself does actually impact upon the wealthiest most, in terms of how much of the actual carbon tax bill they're going to pay. They are the major taxpayers, and we can be clear about that. And there are various mechanisms that we can introduce which focus on luxury goods that wealthier income deciles are much more likely to use with a carbon tax. And at the same time, what we can see is that while we have a carbon tax is going to tackle that energy consumption directly, there's also a place for wealth taxes aside from that, which may also be related to the kind of emissions that the extractive industries are producing, but they're not carbon taxes in a stricter sense, but they're a broader category of taxation called wealth taxation. Sorry, I'm conscious that I've got a minute, so I'm kind of skimming over this slightly. But this is something that we look at quite a lot in the paper as well, is how you can introduce taxes on wealth to complement a tax on carbon while mitigating negative impacts on poorer income groups. So that's the nexus of the discussion, is how to tease out those 3 points, so that on the one hand you have carbon and environmental taxes, on the other you have wealth taxes, which are not carbon and environmental taxes, but nevertheless are targeting wealthier income groups. And then you have to have, at the same time, in our image of this policy mix, it's very important to have an eco-welfare state, ensuring that the negative impacts are meaningfully mitigated. And hopefully, by realizing that, we can start to move towards carbon taxes at a rate which means that they will really bring about meaningful emissions reductions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In Austria, we've had a discussion for over 30 years to introduce a carbon tax. Finally, we got it 2.5 years ago. So it was a long discussion. And the one argument that always was brought about at the 11th hour, just before the budget speech was taking place, was, oh, if we think about it, it's going to have regressive effects on poorer households, which is true if you don't do anything about it. And this is why it's so interesting. And of course, in light of the current coalition discussions with the involved parties, we have the carbon tax, but the question whether a wealth tax could complement it actually in order to make it a progressive project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rochelle Ramphal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's my absolute pleasure to provide you with some of the insights into the research that we've been doing in looking at the ideal mix of policies that both South Africa and the rest of Africa can adopt in order to support a reduction in carbon emissions. So myself and my colleague Kgalalelo, we form part of a bigger team that has kind of stratified this massive problem that the entire world is dealing with. And we've tried to take it apart into bite-sized pieces. I call it bite-sized, if I might indulge you that way. Yeah, just in particular, where we're looking at, we've got one person who's looking at transport, we've got another person who's looking at the mining sector. Kgalalelo herself has been looking quite intensively into carbon pricing. I think what we have found in the global south is that what happens is that the developed world leads and much of Africa and the global south then tries to adapt from developed world policies, and that in this particular instance, it's not going to be an exact sort of fit. So yes, we do agree there's no one size fits all, and we try to look at something that we could adopt for the developing world as such. But in particular, I think South Africa as a whole, like the rest of the world, it similarly shares the mandate to transform its energy system. One, to achieve its climate targets, as it has pledged in the Paris Agreement. But two, to also ensure that there is affordable energy access for all, and that as a country can maintain energy security. The country has been plagued with energy shortages, and it's had massive ramifications of load shedding, and that has affected the economy, and has the country as a whole has had to try and find better means to actually then transform towards renewable energy, because the energy system is somewhat compromised. That being said, South Africa's, when it does have power, majority of its power, 80% of its power is sourced from coal. So all of the indicators are there towards a transition. So from a policy mix perspective, where South Africa sits is that on one hand, it has a carbon tax, and on the other hand, it has to find ways to incentivize renewable energy technology in order to kind of find a common ground where you can then secure a greater share of renewable energy access. So I think in particular, these policy goals can be achieved by a number of reforms that can then promote the low carbon economy. So that looks at substituting and providing financial instruments to actually encourage the renewable energy generation. So notably on, tax regulatory policies such as carbon emissions. South Africa has been a forerunner in that space in being the first African country to adopt a carbon tax. But having said that, it has to balance high levels of inequality, which then means that the carbon tax could risk disproportionately affecting low-income populations, and particularly those that are reliant on carbon-intensive industries like the mining sector. Additionally, faces industrial pushback from industries who cite the cost burdens as being a sort of challenge that they have to mitigate. Having said that, the carbon tax revenue can provide, can really support social programs to offset regressive effects on low-income households and the transition away to cleaner technologies. But essentially, what's critical that's missing is that public trust. So, the way, the transparency in the way in which revenues are also handled then speaks towards building a better sense of trust in government and how funds are actually managed in itself. So along with the climate challenge, challenges that most countries face, I think that South Africa's unique social and economic and environmental context then places it under further burden. So where we've been looking at, there have been a number of reforms tried to be that were put in place towards providing tax incentives to support the solar photovoltaic cells, and that sort of adoption by businesses and the individuals. It was a 2-year program that was introduced, but it hasn't had too much of a success in actually reducing that reliance on coal as an energy source. So there's a field of work that we've been doing recently where we were looking at other, how countries have put together other sort of financial regulatory policies, such as feed-in tariffs and net metering. And in as much as South Africa did consider a feed-in tariff at one point, and it actually didn't take off for a number of reasons. The research that we were looking at actually supports the fact that tax incentives alone are not enough to try to support a sort of transition, that, feed-in tariffs, a balancing of feed-in tariffs, and even considering other policy tools like net metering could then form a better basis to support renewable energy access. So at present, the South African government is currently looking at net metering and the successful design of how that can be put into place. So in particular, if we having set that sort of context, the other challenge that the country faces is
one more minute, please.
One moment. Is the subsidies for fossil fuels often outweigh those for renewables, and that actually distorts the market, and it has delayed the energy transition. The other issue that it faces is that South Africa imposes taxes on fossil fuel consumption, production, and income, and it actually that contributes 2% of GDP. So those are the considerations that need to be considered as well. In essence, I think we can agree with the earlier speakers in the fact that I think you have multiple agencies offering different sort of incentives, and somehow streamlining those processes and creating a simple system is something that's going to really work, more especially, I think, in the global south. That if there could be a sort of cleanup operation as such, where you can then slot in all the necessary policies that then talk to each other. And the bureaucratic obstacles, lengthy waiting periods, complex forms, and requirements can be reduced. It would do a lot of good for reducing onerous sort of legislation that's in place. So I think having regional and national coordination and transparent and predictable policy will support much of the effort that's required towards arriving at our climate goals. So I think time has elapsed. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Kalalelo, who will take you through a lot more of the details of climate policy, carbon pricing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. I think we have a common thread going through already. Of course, carbon taxation is important, but it's by far not enough. We need a mix. And at the same time, also, you highlighted what we have heard already from Jacqueline, that taking inequality seriously is really, really important, with the added complication of shortages and other challenges like a reliance on coal in South Africa still. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next presentation by Kalalelo Makamela. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invite, and it's a pleasure to share insights on the carbon tax in South Africa. So just a bit of background. Before it was legislated in June 2019, there was over a decade of discussions around the carbon tax, and there was quite a big pushback from industry due to the adverse effects it would have on the economy. So to introduce it, they were going to have a first phase, and then the policy would be in the lenient phase. So the rules would not be as stringent, and it was supposed to be from 2019 to the end of last year, but that has then been extended to the end of 2025. So our research looks at this carbon tax. Is it really incentivizing businesses to invest in these green technologies that we need to limit the effects of climate change? Currently, the carbon tax in South Africa is about 10 euros per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's not even the effective price. So businesses get between 60 to 90% of free emission allowances. So that reduces the overall effective carbon tax rate. So if we look at a mine that can get potentially 90% of the emissions free, we're looking at €1 per ton of carbon dioxide that they would then pay for their emissions. I mean, that is a very low rate, and businesses in South Africa would then rather pay the carbon tax than invest in green technologies. Our research found that if a business was to invest in a solar plant, they would need to, the carbon tax in South Africa would need to increase by at least 35 euros. So at that point in the investment decision, they are at a break even. So at that point, they are at the break even point where they would not necessarily invest or disinvest. So if we add a cent extra, then they will be at a positive net present value where they would then invest in these green technologies. So this low rate and these generous free emission allowances is quite a problem in South Africa. But we understand that there needs to be a balance of transitioning and also the inequalities and the low income country that we are in. That balance needs to be there, but we find that the policy is more on the lenient side and we're not necessarily decarbonizing.